Russian President Vladimir Putin courts African leaders in St. Petersburg in an effort to bolster ties on the continent. Hi everyone, I'm Sean Caleb sitting in today for Naidu, and you are watching The Heat. Heads of state from 17 African nations joined President Putin in St. Petersburg this week for the second Russia-Africa Summit. Discussions included Moscow's withdrawal from the Black Sea grain deal, the Ukraine conflict, and Russia's efforts to expand trade and defense ties. We're going to begin with this report from CGTN's Isabel Nakira in St. Petersburg.
Russia says it's opening up new grain routes to ensure food reaches Africa on time, so that grain trading is not dependent on the UK and US insurance companies, who may be unable to insure ships traversing the Black Sea now that Russia's withdrawn from the grain deal. One of the options being considered is exporting directly to Turkey with payments managed by Qatar. Russia exited the Black Sea Grain Initiative earlier in the month, saying neither it nor Africa was benefiting. The first shipments of 50,000 tons of grain will go to 6 African countries. But the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres hit back at Russia's offer, saying a handful of donations to some countries won't correct the dramatic impact of the grain deal's collapse. While South Africa isn't one of the recipients, its delegates are optimistic about what's been offered at the summit.
I've witnessed contracts being signed for real. I witnessed the Russian delegations, most of them saying, when can we start work?
Russia has also written off $23 billion of Africa's debts, saying it's eager to grow business on the continent. The Russian Export Center will support domestic companies in the country to open up new investment opportunities in Africa. Russia has also committed to supplying and upgrading military hardware in Africa and offered help fighting terrorism and mediating conflicts, though some analysts say conflicts like those in Sudan can only be solved internally.
Russia can only take a neutral stance and call on the two warring factions to stop the war. And in recent history, it hasn't had a role in mediating to stop an armed conflict.
Moscow says it's concerned about the situation in Niger and is watching it keenly. But on Friday, Russian mercenary leader Prigozhin, who was seen at the summit, said he supported the coup and offered Wagner's services to the self-appointed new leader. Russia has offered to invest in nuclear energy in Africa too. The first plant is still due to be constructed in Egypt, where progress has stalled since Russia first signed a deal with Cairo in 2008. The foreign ministry says threats by the West will not deter it from doing business with Africa and warned against interfering in their discussions. Isabel Nakira, CGTN, St. Petersburg.
For more on the Russia-Africa Summit, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Cape Town is Sanusha Naidu. She's a senior research fellow with the Institute for Global Dialogue. Here in Washington, D.C., Abdullahi Boru Halakhe. He is an African security and policy analyst. And from Moscow, Anton Fedyashin. He's a Russian and European history professor at American University. And Mark Sleboda. He is a Moscow-based international affairs and security analyst. I want to thank you all for joining us. A lot to get to. Mark, I want to start with you, please. President Vladimir Putin told African leaders on Friday that he is committed to expanding Russia's role on the continent. Now, what do you think that looks like, and how important is this meeting going to be in St. Petersburg?
Well, Russian-African trade right now has reached some $18 billion a year and is growing. In fact, it has been growing not insignificantly over the last year, despite Western sanctions against Russia and Western pressure and threats of secondary sanctions against sovereign African countries for daring to do business with Africa. Russia is the world's #1 exporter of both grain and fertilizer, and a very significant part of that is, due to shipments to the developing countries of Africa. But Russia has numerous other business interests in Africa, helping develop natural resources. It has a lot of oil and mineral expertise to offer. And it has military and security ties with a number of African states as well. So I think Putin is looking to build on all of that.
Sanusha, let's pick up on what Mark said. It's true that there's an $18 billion in trade and other entities going on with African nations, but that is a far cry from what Putin wanted just 1 year ago. He'd hoped for $40 billion in 5 years, but according to TASS, the Russian agency says it's only reached $18 billion, mostly from arms and grain sales. But it's not a lot when you consider how much perhaps a country like China, $282 billion in trade with African nations. So what are African nations looking at from Russia, from Putin right now?
Yeah, I think the issue around the actual figure in terms of trade with the continent between Russia and African countries, I think in the context of looking at the continent and looking at the number of countries that make up the continent, that number becomes very difficult to disaggregate in terms of the value, the scale. I think it'll also be important to disaggregate which countries are receiving the bulk of that kind of trade from Russia. Also, in the context of breaking down that trade profile, is to look at how much does Africa sell to Russia, but also how much does Africa buy from Russia. And I think the exports from Russia kind of also impact on that trade profile. Right now, the second Russia-Africa Summit, I think from the African side, there are a number of different expectations. I think the first and foremost one is, as you're looking at the leaders giving their keynote addresses, and if you listen to President Putin's address as well, you're getting a sense that there's also this idea, and President Ramaphosa of South Africa spoke about it in his address, about this kind of independence of your foreign policy by African countries, to be able to understand and make their decisions as sovereign states. So this is becoming a key, significant narrative, and of course there's a lot of issues that are circling this narrative at the summit in terms of having to deal with the kinds of narratives that put out the impact that Africa cannot make these kinds of foreign policy decisions on who it wants to engage with, and that is becoming a key issue in that. And President Putin is picking it up quite succinctly and utilizing it in terms of talking about this narrative and where Africa fits in the whole broader context of the global arena. I think secondly is the question on the access to food security, and the promise that President Putin made to 5 or 6 African countries that they'll get grain free of charge, and then of course the writing off of debt. So I think at this point in time it's also about Africa's sovereignty and independence in terms of asserting its agency and voice.
Abdullahi, I think one thing the African nations have been very unified on is talking about this Black Sea grain deal. The fact that Russia pulled out of it, and with the global food shortage so critical right now, the UN General Secretary weighed in on this, and here's what Antonio Gutierrez had to say about this.
It is clear that when taking out of the market millions and millions of tons of grains, it is clear that, based on economic laws, that will lead to higher prices than the ones that would exist with the normal access of Ukrainian grains to international markets. And this increase of prices will be paid by everybody, everywhere.
What's your take on that? The African nations clearly very concerned, because everybody is so concerned about the most developing nations, the poorest nations. Those are the ones that really stand to suffer the greatest now that this deal has been scrapped, at least for the time being.
No, thank you so much. I think one of the things that we need to do is to step back a little bit and look at where we are within the geopolitics within which this is taking place. For instance, we might not be in a multipolar world, but we are definitely not in a unipolar world as well. So in terms of Russia's foray into the African continent, I think it is coming within that kind of realm. Secondly, to your point about the food insecurity, where for a country like Somalia, for instance, last year, famine was barely averted, right? And Somalia import 90% of its food aid. I'm just using Somalia as an example for now. This is critical. But I think we should not also lose sight of the fact that majority of the people who are benefiting from the grain deal are not necessarily from the African countries. Sure, they will suffer the acute reality of that number of metric tons of grain being taken out of circulation. But in reality, Europe disproportionately benefits from this. But one of the things that needs to be spoken about is it's not just so much about Africa and Russia or Africa versus Russia and others, but it's also the question of Africans themselves. Why is Africa suffering disproportionately when it comes to food insecurity? I think the ball is within the African policymakers, not just running away from more accountability from the West and running into Russia, but also saying, look, we can double dip, figuring out where gives us the best deal for the people who are in need of the aid.
Anton, as we mentioned earlier, President Putin is pledging to send up to 50,000 tons of grain to 6 African nations, free of charge. This is what President Putin had to say about that.
Our country will continue supporting needy states and regions, in particular with its humanitarian deliveries. We seek to actively participate in building a fairer system of the distribution of resources. We are taking maximum efforts to avert a global food crisis.
So, Anton, 50,000 tons of free grain, I get that. But if you look at what the UN says the agreement did in the previous year, it was 32 million tons of corn and grain. Tell me what you're thinking right now about President Putin's pledge, and how do you think the African nations are going to absorb this?
Sure, I think that the African nations will be grateful for at least the tens of thousands of tons of grain. Let's keep in mind that of the 32 million that you just mentioned, only about 3% went to the countries that are in most need of this grain. And all your viewers can easily check these numbers and all the stats because they're on the UN's Black Sea grain website, which has all the bar graphs and pie graphs to represent where the grain is going. You played a clip from General Secretary Guterres a second ago, and he's absolutely right about the Ukrainian grains absent from the market driving up the prices. But he also conveniently forgot to mention that Russian grain, which was supposed to be exported to the rest of the world, not just to Africa, and which was part of the deal, also been blocked by the Western nations. And its absence from the world's market, and Russia is the largest producer and exporter of grain in the world, has also driven up prices. So unfortunately, there's a lot of geopolitical games going on. The remarkable thing that I found about Russia-Africa Summit today, and especially the roundtable speeches from all of the representatives of the countries, is that they addressed each other as equals. There was no lecturing by the Russians or by anyone else of other parties about what they should do, why they should do it, who they should associate with, and who they shouldn't. And in that sense, this was quite a different feel to what we've seen fairly recently during, for example, the EU Latin America Summit, and by the way, from Kamala Harris's visit to 3 African nations in March of this year, where it was a lot of ordering around and lecturing, and only $100 million that the United States committed to those nations, which of course is a drop in the bucket for a continent that has 1.5 billion people in terms of population.
Abdullahi, I'd like you to expand, because when I was watching Anton respond there just a second ago, I could see you shaking your head in the monitor. How do you think African nations are, what their take is on President Putin's pledge for the free grain, and also the fact that this grain deal is completely up in the air at this point?
The grain deal might be up in the air, But if Russia follows through in what it is promising, then the impact of them pulling out of the deal will not be as severe. Like what I was noting when Anton was speaking is the reality that this is made about African countries going to suffer, when in reality, for the period of when the deal was in place, disproportionately, it's not the African countries that were getting. I understand that the impact of removing that amount of grain from the market would lead to Africans paying a steep price in terms of how they will get it within the market. But I think it should be made very clear that they were not the disproportionate beneficiaries of that. Europe is also benefiting from this. And also there are nuances around, the sanctions and the banking and the shipping industries that Russia was asking in order for it to continue with the grain deal. So I just want to step back and say again, the reality is the Western countries will need to do more than just saying, or if you will, lecturing African countries, no, don't take this side, don't take that side. Where is a European Africa policy? Where is the implementation of the American Africa policy, so that Africans are given a menu of options from which they can choose? I'm not sitting here suggesting that African countries are angels and that kind of situation. They need also their own agency rather than constantly telling people, oh no, we need to be given a chance. African leaders need to step up to the plate and take the initiative, not always reacting to either what the Russians are saying or what the Western countries are saying.
Sanusha, let me ask you, do you think that the 17 African nations, there were significantly more, I believe more than 40, and I'm working from memory, in the last Russia-Africa Summit. Do you believe these nations come and they're very united? Are they discussing things with President Putin at a place of strength, at a place of power? Do they have the upper hand in any way at this point?
Yeah, I think, the focus on the number of African leaders that are in attendance at the summit, and what was it in 2019, and that has been the narrative that, this tends to suggest that African leaders are moving away, or there's a significant drop in that kind of engagement with President Putin and with Russia. I think you've got to go beyond the numbers. If you listen to some of the speeches that were made at the roundtable, the fact of the matter is some of those leaders in attendance are leaders that also have a relationship with the U.S., with the EU, with the Western world. And it does raise questions around how they want to actually leverage themselves. The second point to make is that it's not just the African leaders that are there. It's the AU, the chairperson of the AU Commission, it's the president of the New Development Bank of the BRICS, and there are other ministers that are representing their countries and not necessarily heads of states that are in attendance. For example, from Kenya, and Kenya was quite a critic of the Russia's withdrawal from the Black Sea grain deal, because it raised questions around how they're also seeing this relationship with Russia in terms of the impact and the fallout from that. So I think what is important to note is that there is a unified set of issues that they're coming around, and that is they're recognizing that for the first, for a period of time they don't want to be dictated to. They feel that they need that space to engage. Now, the question, I think, as my colleagues have raised, is how does African agency, not just talking about political leadership, etc., how do they represent the people on the ground? Because I think this summit also brings into focus the question of the governance issues in Africa as well, in terms of what kind of united front are you taking to the summits? Do you have a set of issues that are common areas of interest and consensus? And it doesn't have to be everybody going with their national interest, but it talks to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, continental development plans, etc. And I think some of the challenges that we see that is being about the issues at the global level in terms of where Africa is footing, I think also raises questions in terms of Africa's own governance issues between itself and its people, leaders and their people.
Anton, also President Putin has said that many nations did not show because the West, particularly the United States, were leaning on these nations not to show up. And at the same time, Russia said that the West is using this grain deal as political blackmail. But Kenya's foreign minister is calling the grain deal a stab in the back. Explain Moscow's stand on all of this.
Well, Moscow's stand is that this was a deal, which by definition means that there are two or more sides involved in it. The deal was that the Russians would allow Ukrainian grain exports to proceed through the Black Sea in exchange for their own grain exports and exports of their fertilizer to proceed from Russian ports to the rest of the world. They patiently waited for almost a year, 9 months to be exact, for the Europeans and the West in general to fulfill their end of the deal, and not a single part of what the Russians were promised when the deal was signed in Istanbul was fulfilled by the West. So after 9 months of unilaterally allowing the grain to leave Ukraine and not being able to export their own products, they decided to not renew the deal. That's the Russian perspective on things. They have, by the way, also clearly stated that the moment that the West actually fulfills the obligations that it agreed to through the UN, they will also allow the grain exports from Ukraine to restart. So we'll see what happens.
Okay. Mark, I apologize. It's been a while since I chatted with you. You've been there very patient. If you want to follow up on anything that's been said, please, by all means. But I kind of want to switch gears and talk about the fact that the Wagner mercenary group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, was photographed meeting on the sidelines with African officials, and the group has operated in several African nations since 2017. What can you tell us about the Wagner's group, its operations in the continent of Africa, and is military muscle something that Russia sees as a way to expand its presence throughout that continent?
Yeah, first let me know that the Kiev regime is going to continue to export large amounts of its grain from the arid parts of the country that it controls through Europe. It's true that numerous Eastern European states have blocked banned Ukrainian grain and agricultural products so it doesn't lower the prices of their own farmers, but they do allow transit rights. And it is, you know, the European states of NATO, as well as China, that were actually the biggest beneficiaries of the grain deal. Secondly, far be it from me to disagree with the Secretary General. I'm not an expert on global food markets. But I can't help but notice that The Economist last week, talking about a report of global food market experts, concluded that actually due to bumper crops of grain this year from Russia and Australia, that they actually didn't think that Ukraine's loss of grain trade through the Black Sea was going to really negatively affect the global market on food at all. In fact, they thought that it might actually lower prices this year compared to last year, despite. So it appears that, you know, that Ukrainian grain isn't actually that important to global markets at all. I mean, I'm sure that there are some Spanish ham pigs that may suffer. I understand that they were some of the biggest recipient. You know, they may have to go on a weight loss program. But, you know, for the rest of the world, I think they're going to get along just fine.
Okay, we'll see how that plays out. Now, what about the Wagner group?
Yeah. Wagner is a forbidden organization in Russia due to a recent attempt to either seize power in the country, a very aborted, or an attempt to force whom the tycoon, who is the financial backer of the mercenary organization, to dictate who the Russian Secretary of Defense should be in the middle of a conflict. He, you know, as part of a deal, was supposedly ostracized from the country. What his presence in St. Petersburg, palling it up with various African leaders, may say about the reality of that situation, was it all some kind of smoke and mirrors? I can't say, but Wagner does have significant security contracts in Europe, in Africa, and a number of African countries have turned to Wagner specifically after kicking out French military forces, particularly in West Africa, where see France's colonial legacy as malicious and having a negative impact still on the sovereignty of those countries. And it appears that Wagner's business interests in Africa, those security contracts will continue.
Sanusha, the talks have really been dominated by efforts to bring Russia and Ukraine back to the negotiating table, to try to find a way out of this long conflict. And Ramaphosa, who you mentioned earlier, has been one of the people leading this push. And here's what he had to say just a bit earlier.
As South Africa, we are steadfast in our position that negotiation and dialogue and adherence to the United Nations Charter are necessary for the peaceful and just resolution of conflicts. It is our hope that constructive engagement and negotiation can bring about an end to the ongoing conflict between the Russian Federation and Ukraine.
Well, Putin said he's going to look over this information, but one thing that the African nations were very clear about, they want to be taken very seriously, and they really want a hand in finding a way to bring peace to that region. What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, it is part of the group that went to Russia and Ukraine as part of the African Peace Mission. It is a heavy toll on these 6 countries that were part of that delegation that went in to discuss both with the Ukrainian president and, of course, the Russian president around a peace mission and a peace intervention. And as President Ramaphosa has indicated in that speech, it's part of South Africa's narrative and part of its peace resolution approach to peace and stability and development, that you look for a peaceful transition and a resolution in terms of the UN process. And I think that is going to be something, whether or not the African Peace Mission is able to achieve what it needs to achieve, because really right now, at the moment, it's much larger than just the African nation. It's countries that are also within the purview, within the neighborhood, who are basically resistant to a peaceful resolution in terms of what kind of peace accord you want to have and what kind of conditions of that peace accord will be acceptable. So it's quite a difficult one to call right now, but I suspect that the African countries also remember that this is something that they caught in the collateral damage of in terms of the fallout with this crisis.
Abdullahi, we don't have a lot of time left, but I'd like to get you to weigh in on this topic.
Yeah, I think it's a long shot. Symbolically, it's a good thing that they want to do. But in the long run, I think it will take more than good intentions to strike a deal for a conflict that has gone on for over 500 days now.
And Mark, I'll give you perhaps the final word in all this. Let me get your take on this, because clearly so many countries around the world are trying to find some kind of solution to get these two sides talking. Do you think it is really the long shot that Abdullahi just talked about? I think a lot of people would probably say yes.
Yeah, the Kiev regime has actually passed laws forbidding any of its politicians, including its leader, the president, Zelensky, from conducting any negotiations with Russia. Russia is willing to conduct negotiations, but not only on the terms that it set out at the beginning, but because of the escalation by NATO, those also include recognizing the referendum results in Zaporozhye and Kherson as well. So Russia's position has only toughened. I don't see peace anytime in the short or medium term. I think this conflict could go on for years.
I want to thank our panel very much. It's been an engaging and interesting conversation, and a lot more to cover. Sadly, this story isn't going away, so I'm sure we'll talk about it again. And that does it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Sean Calebs here in Washington, D.C. Thanks, everyone, for watching.